Picture a cozy Victorian home. A fire crackles warmly in the hearth, a symbol of comfort and domestic bliss. But behind that comforting glow lies one of the darkest and most brutal secrets of the Industrial Revolution. It's a story written in soot and tears, etched onto the skylines of London not by adults, but by the smallest and most vulnerable members of society. This is the grim, terrifying, and almost unbelievable story of the child chimney sweeps, the so-called climbing boys whose short, miserable lives fueled the fires of an empire. We often romanticize the Victorian era, thinking of steam engines, grand inventions, and elegant fashion. But beneath this veneer of progress was a hidden world of unimaginable cruelty, and nowhere was it more apparent than in the narrow, suffocating darkness of a chimney flue. The very architecture of the time created a demand for a unique and horrifying form of labor. As cities like London exploded in population, houses were built taller and crammed closer together. Their chimneys weren't the straight, wide structures we might imagine today. They were a labyrinthine maze of twists, turns, and sharp angles, designed to snake through multiple floors and rooms. Some flues were as narrow as 9 inches square, a space barely large enough for a modern shoebox to pass through. Compounding this architectural challenge was the fuel source of the era: coal. Unlike wood, coal burned with a thick, greasy, and highly flammable soot called creosote. This substance would cling to the inside of these complex chimneys, building up layer by dangerous layer. If left unchecked, this buildup was a ticking time bomb. A single stray spark could ignite the creosote, turning the chimney into a roaring inferno capable of burning an entire house, or even a whole city block, to the ground. Chimney fires were a constant and terrifying threat in Victorian cities. So keeping chimneys clean wasn't just a matter of household tidiness. It was a critical issue of public safety. The solution, however, was as grim as the problem. No adult could possibly fit into these tortuous, narrow passages. The only tool that could navigate every nook and cranny was a small, flexible human body. The only body small enough belonged to a child. And so, an entire industry was born, an industry that relied on the systematic exploitation of children. Where did these children come from? The supply chain was as heartbreaking as the job itself. Many were orphans, wards of the parish who were seen as little more than a drain on public resources. The parish authorities would sell these children, some as young as 4 or 5, into apprenticeships with master sweeps. It was a transaction, pure and simple, ridding the state of a mouth to feed and providing the master sweep with a new tool for his trade. For a few pounds, a child's life was signed away into what was effectively a state-sanctioned form of slavery. Other children came from families crushed by extreme poverty. In an era with no social safety net, a family with too many children and not enough food faced impossible choices. A desperate father or mother might sell their son to a master sweep, convincing themselves it was better than watching him starve. They were promised their child would be fed, housed, and taught a trade. The reality was a nightmare they couldn't have imagined. Then there were the darkest acquisitions: kidnapping. Unscrupulous master sweeps were known to snatch children from the streets, luring them with sweets or simply grabbing them when no one was looking. Once in the sweep's possession, these children disappeared from the world, their families left to wonder what became of them. They were given new names and absorbed into a life of anonymous drudgery. The ideal candidate for this horrific job was heartbreakingly specific. The master sweeps looked for the smallest, thinnest boys they could find. Malnourishment was an asset. A skinny, underdeveloped child could fit into the narrowest flues. Most climbing boys were between the ages of 6 and 10, though records show children as young as 4 being forced up chimneys. They were chosen for their agility and their perceived disposability. To the master sweep, these weren't children. They were living, breathing brushes, tools to be used and discarded. Their small hands and feet could find purchase on the rough brickwork, and their slight frames could contort to navigate the impossible angles of the flues. The apprenticeship contract they were bound to was a cruel joke. It was supposed to be a 7-year term, after which they would become a journeyman sweep. In reality, few survived that long. The contract gave the master sweep absolute legal control over the child. He could beat them, starve them, and work them to the point of collapse with no legal repercussions. The child was his property. Nothing can truly prepare you for the sheer terror of a child's first climb. Imagine being a small boy, perhaps 6 years old, dragged from your bed before dawn. You are stripped naked or left in filthy rags, your skin exposed to the elements and the abrasive materials ahead. You are led to a grand house, brought into a dark room and forced to stare up into a black, gaping hole. This is your new world, the chimney. The master sweep orders you to climb. The darkness is absolute, a suffocating void that presses in from all sides. The air is thick with old, acrid soot that immediately clogs your nose and throat, making you cough and choke with every breath. The brickwork is rough and sharp, tearing at your bare knees and elbows, scraping your skin raw until you bleed. You are armed with a small, stiff brush to scrape the soot from the walls, but your main tools are your own body parts, used to dislodge the caked on creosote. The climb is a torturous inch-by-inch struggle upwards, your muscles screaming in protest. Panic sets in. The space is so tight you can barely move. You feel the walls closing in, the weight of the house pressing down on you. You want to scream, to cry, to go back down. But hesitation was not an option. Master sweeps had a repertoire of brutal methods to encourage reluctant climbers. The most common was pricking their feet. The master would follow the child up the first few feet of the chimney and jab their soles with a long pin or a sharp stick, the pain forcing the child to scramble upwards to escape. An even more monstrous technique was lighting a fire in the grate. If a child was stuck or refused to climb, the master would light a small fire of straw or newspaper below them. The smoke and heat would surge up the flue, forcing the terrified child to choose between being burned alive or continuing their ascent into the suffocating darkness. The choice was no choice at all. It was climb or die. Once at the top, the child would emerge into the cold morning air, gasping for breath, their body a mess of cuts, scrapes, and soot. But there was no rest. They had to shout down the chimney, all up, to signal they had made it before making the perilous journey back down. This process would be repeated multiple times a day, at house after house, from dawn until dusk. The daily life of a climbing boy was a catalog of dangers, each one capable of maiming or killing. The most immediate and terrifying risk was getting stuck. In the winding, narrow flues, a child could easily take a wrong turn or find themselves in a passage that was too tight to move through. Panic would set in, their breathing would become shallow, and the lack of oxygen in the soot-filled space would quickly lead to suffocation. The horror was compounded when this happened. If a boy became stuck, the master's first solution was often to send another, smaller boy up to try and pull him out. If that failed, the only option was to start knocking down the brickwork of the house, a costly and time-consuming process. By the time they reached the trapped child, it was almost always too late. They would be pulling out a lifeless, soot-caked body. Falls were another constant threat. Chimney stacks towered over Victorian streets, and the boys had to navigate these precarious heights with no safety equipment. A slip on a wet roof or a loose brick could send a child plummeting to their death. They could also fall inside the chimney itself, tumbling down the long, dark shaft to be broken on the hearth below. But even if a boy survived the immediate dangers of suffocation and falls, the job was slowly and insidiously killing him from the inside out. The soot was more than just dirt. It was a toxic cocktail of chemicals and carcinogens. The children breathed it in constantly. It coated their lungs, leading to a host of respiratory illnesses that left them with a permanent, hacking cough known as soot war. The soot got into their eyes, causing painful inflammation and, over time, blindness. It was embedded so deeply into their skin that it became a part of them, a permanent black stain that no amount of washing could ever remove. This constant exposure deformed their bodies. The strain of contorting their limbs in the narrow flues stunted their growth and warped their bones. Their kneecaps would be worn away, their joints swollen and inflamed, and their spines twisted. By the time they reached adolescence, if they lived that long, they were often crippled for life, their bodies broken by years of relentless abuse. However, there was one disease so specific and so horrific that it became synonymous with the trade. It was known as chimney sweeps cancer. This was the first occupationally linked cancer ever identified by doctors. The constant exposure to soot, which collected in the folds of the scrotum, caused a particularly aggressive form of squamous cell carcinoma. The boys rarely bathed, and the carcinogenic soot would be ground into their skin day after day, year after year. The disease was agonizing. It caused painful sores, tumors, and immense suffering, eventually leading to a slow and excruciating death. It typically appeared in sweeps as they reached their late teens or early 20s, a grim reward for surviving the initial dangers of the job. It meant that even for the boys who managed to escape the chimneys, their fate was often already sealed. There was no escaping the soot. Their life outside the chimney was just as bleak. The master sweeps provided the bare minimum of care. The boys often slept in cellars on sacks filled with the very soot they had collected during the day. These soot sacks served as their beds, their only source of warmth. They were perpetually cold, perpetually hungry, and perpetually filthy. Bathing was a rarity, perhaps once a week if they were lucky, but often only a few times a year. The stench that clung to them was overwhelming, a mixture of soot, sweat, and neglect. This filth made them social outcasts. On the rare occasions they were not working, they were shunned by society. People would cross the street to avoid them. Other children were forbidden from playing with them. They were seen as untouchable, living symbols of the dirt and grime of the industrial city. This isolation was profound. They had no family, no friends, no education, and no hope for a future beyond the next chimney. They were trapped in a cycle of abuse and misery, completely alone in the world. Their only human contact was often the brutal hand of their master. Beatings were a routine part of their existence, a method of discipline and control. They were given just enough food to keep them working, often scraps and leftovers unfit for anyone else. They were ghosts haunting the city, their small, blackened faces a common sight, yet they remained completely invisible to the society that depended on their suffering. But even in this darkness, flickers of humanity began to emerge. Voices of protest started to rise against this barbaric practice. As early as the late 18th century, reformers like Jonas Hanway began campaigning to raise awareness. In 1803, the Society for Superseding the Necessity of Climbing Boys was formed. They championed the development of mechanical alternatives to clean chimneys. An inventor named George Smart developed a clever device consisting of a series of interlocking canes and a brush head, which could be pushed up a chimney from the bottom. It was called the Smart Brush, and it worked. However, a powerful lobby of master sweeps fiercely resisted this new technology. They argued falsely that the machines couldn't clean the complex angled flues as effectively as a child. The truth was simpler. A machine cost money to buy and maintain, while a child could be bought cheaply and worked for nothing more than scraps of food. Greed and tradition stood in the way of progress and compassion. The cause of the climbing boys found powerful champions in the world of art and literature. The poet William Blake, in his Songs of Innocence and of Experience, wrote 2 poems titled The Chimney Sweeper. These works exposed the grim reality of the boys' lives to a wider audience, contrasting their childlike innocence with the dark, corrupt world they inhabited. His lines, "So your chimneys I sweep and in soot I sleep," became a haunting indictment of societal neglect. Decades later, Charles Dickens, a fierce critic of social injustice, touched upon the plight of chimney sweeps in his novels, most notably in Oliver Twist, where the villainous sweep Mr. Gamfield attempts to take Oliver on as an apprentice. But perhaps the most influential work was Charles Kingsley's 1863 novel, The Water Babies. It told the fantastical story of Tom, a young chimney sweep who drowns and is transformed into a water baby. The book was a massive success and brought the issue directly into the nurseries of the middle and upper classes, making it impossible for them to ignore the suffering of the children who cleaned their own chimneys. This growing public awareness slowly translated into political action, but the road to legislative reform was agonizingly long and fraught with setbacks. The The first major piece of legislation was the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834, which outlawed the apprenticeship of boys under the age of 10 and forbade forcing anyone to climb a flue against their will. It was a step in the right direction, but it was weak and full of loopholes. A more significant law, the Act of 1840, made it illegal for anyone under the age of 21 to sweep chimneys. This should have been the end of the climbing boys. But tragically, the act lacked any real enforcement mechanism. Master sweeps simply ignored it. There were no official inspectors, and magistrates were often reluctant to prosecute offenders. The practice continued in the shadows, just as brutal as before. The fight was taken up by the tireless social reformer, Lord Shaftesbury. For decades, he campaigned in Parliament, presenting evidence of the continued abuse and deaths of child sweeps. Final tragic impetus for change came in 1875. A 12-year-old boy named George Brewster was sent by his master, William Wire, to clean the chimneys at Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridgeshire. George got stuck in a narrow flue. Despite his cries, Wire forced him to continue. When he became completely trapped, it took hours for workers to dismantle the brickwork to get to him. By the time they reached him, George Brewster was dead. The case caused a national outcry. The public was horrified. Lord Shaftesbury seized the moment, using the story of George Brewster to shame Parliament into action. Finally, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 was passed. This time, the law had teeth. It mandated that all chimney sweepers had to be licensed by the police, and the police were given the power to enforce the ban on child labor. The penalty for noncompliance was severe. It took nearly a century of struggle, but the era of the climbing boys was finally, officially over. The story of the Victorian chimney sweeps is a chilling chapter in our history. It serves as a brutal reminder that the great leaps forward of the Industrial Revolution were often built on the broken bodies of the most vulnerable. These children were sacrificed for the comfort and safety of a society that chose to look away. Their small, soot-stained ghosts still linger in our collective memory, a testament to unimaginable hardship and a warning against the human cost of unchecked progress. Their legacy is not just one of suffering, but also of resilience and the slow, difficult, but ultimately triumphant march towards a more humane world, reminding us that the fight to protect every child's right to a childhood is a battle that must never be abandoned.